I tried to use the combination of Asuka, Rei, and Modernia at different bosses. In particular though, I acted on them and put them as if I'm doing solo raid where I put in suboptimal supports, similar to the units I've talked about in the previous video. In this video also, I'm going to be sharing some strategies I have on boss raiding, so be sure to look forward to that. I could also use litter, and actually putting in litter made my efforts easier as well, but I wanted to see if it was possible with different teams. Using Crown though was also cheating, as both of them completely defeated the purpose of trying to team build a trio with different teams and seeing the possibility of the three. Being an off-element DPS on 4 out of 5 bosses and using suboptimal supports, my goal to last more long enough and deal a good amount of damage while trying to be as offensive as possible. In a solo raid situation, we're not expecting the highest of damages on our team 4 or team 5 that doesn't have the correct element DPS. In solo raid scenario of fire element DPS, for now, I think we'll be splitting them around to balance out the fire DPS. One example is if the core doesn't last long, putting in Red Hood and Asuka together with Mari for taking advantage of the Pierce buff coming from Mari is an option. Meanwhile, Rei could be on another team alongside Modernia along with the other units. Of course, there's still the long-term possibility of grouping the trio together like I've been talking about before, but I think it will be on later fire advantage solo raids once we have better fire DPS units. For this video, I'll be focusing on their performance together and the viability on raid scenarios and my experiences on using both Asuka and Rei. I'll also be providing you substitutes to play around with, the units we have, as well as tips that I have found useful, not only using Rei and Asuka, but raiding in general. I'll talk about the good, the bad on this combo, and everything in between for my findings. It's a team that's not like an easy button click. Despite not having a sniper rifle or rocket launcher that requires intensive clicking mechanics, using this team is testing your game skill in a different way. These anomaly interceptions are also not simple fights where you can just easily AFK the fight. You still have to do your own part of doing the mechanics, taking covers as needed, timing your bursts, and everything between, just like a normal solo raid. So what were my findings? First, I want to get this out of the way before anyone starts. If you are expecting an easy brain-dead team, then the extremely offensive team I've mentioned in the other video will need some adjustments for bossing, and you'll have to take some hit on the total damage if you need to slot in a proper healer. This is normal, and pretty much any team that is forced to slot in a healer will just naturally lose some damage, and that's okay. There's also the Tianaga and the bunnies, but that's too simple, and we'd have to give up Modernia or one of the 2 out of the 3 fire DPS combo together. There's also other on-element advantage DPS that could be benefiting those combo more in that specific raid. So you might have to start slotting in Helm or Query to replace either Asuka or Rei, or even replace Modernia with an off-burst healer like Rapunzel, Bonnie Alice, if you want to have an easy or chill team. So assuming we're trying to build team 4 or team 5 that doesn't have Tianaga, the bunnies, or Crown, and we also want to keep the 3 together, what other defensive option could we have slot in? There are actually options to keep the fire trio together by just replacing the burst 1 or burst 2 category and keeping it healthy. This would be my more preferred method instead, since you can still have the 3 units synergizing off one another. You can utilize Summer Mary or Pepper on burst healer where you slot them as burst 1 and then adding in Dala or Summer Helm as burst 2 for cooldown reduction. So the burst 1 is also an option too and has synergy for being fire, but her healing is a little bit more on the lower end compared to Summer Mary or Pepper at low investment. Since typically we don't usually invest a lot on main healers without offensive buffs, it's hard to justify using Soda as a healer, but nonetheless, it's an option. Alternatively, you can have Dorothy, Litter, D Killer Wife, or Volume as burst 1 and then slotting in a healer on the burst 2 category like Marciana, Rem, Quincy, or even Diesel as tank. There's a lot of flexibility when just making minor adjustments on burst 1 or burst 2 category, and as you can see, it has a decent elemental coverage for different elements. If anything, I'd say the weakest B1 or B2 20-second standalone is the Electric, and while Naga is actually good, she's actually either paired off with Crown or Tia that stops the trio combo. Naturally, using Litter or Crown is the easy solution button. But as mentioned, in a solo raid situation where there's no ideal element DPS with these 3 fired together, then we'll likely be taking suboptimal buffers instead for now. Later on, I could see a future where they'll end up taking better buffers as we take in more specialized teams. Naturally, we'll eventually want to get rid of the neutral DPS on solo raids, but that will take some time still. So for now that I've covered that concern about not having a healer or other defensive solutions, let's talk about using this team where we don't bring in a standard healer. This would be for people willing to min-max their damage a lot more. Bringing in no healer is extremely huge as it can boost your damage up to like 50% or maybe even more. To give an example, the team I built with the healers were only doing between like 2.1 to 2.4 bill. Meanwhile, the one with no healer can reach between 2.6 to 3 bill. Nonetheless, you get the point. No healer, more damage. So in order to survive the whole fight, first we have to understand what are our main defensive options. First, in the boss category where boss targets the highest attack, which is a common trend in solo raid, this is where the Asuka tanking is often brought up. Naturally, this situation is not always the case. In the example of Anomaly, Interception, Emilia, Ultra, and Mirror Container are the main bosses that do target the highest attack units. Meanwhile, Kraken and Harvester is a bit random. One thing I would like to mention was Asuka's burst lifesteal at base performance was not enough to be the tank for these highest attack targets. Let me clarify though before you take this out of context. This is regarding other people's expectation out of a tank. In the best case scenario, whenever we have a healer or a good tank, we just do the runs without thinking much of the boss damage mechanics other than these specific QTEs or these insane one-shots. This means that we can safely ignore those chip damage shots that bosses do, and typically it's those bullet shots that the bosses do without much indicator. The issue with Asuka is you can't expect her to fully tank with just her HP or just use her out of the box and expect to tank every chip damage shots. There are other things that you still need to do to go along with her tanking. There's a few other techniques to alleviate the pressure of her fully tanking, and I will talk about some of them later in the video, but alongside that, you need to make sure your Asuka is well invested. This is where having fully invested skills, proper overload lines, and upgraded armors and upgraded dolls, and sometimes perhaps even having duplicates would come in handy. If you expect Asuka to tank properly without proper investment, then you will be severely disappointed. Next is Rei's shield. Rei's shield, as mentioned in my other video, has a big flaw that I think is glaring, and which is why she's not great as a main defensive unit. That is, she is only shielding fire units. This means that there's going to be some situations where the other units that are taking hits are off element. While her shield can prevent negative status ailments like stun, not everyone is going to be protected, and the other allies that are on fire are going to be forced to either eat the mechanics or use their cover. So for the most part, Rei's shield acts more as a bonus HP to the other fire allies. It can be used to skip boss mechanics if somehow boss mechanic targets the other fire allies, so it's not like it's completely useless. It's just that it's not a very general use for defensive situations. With Asuka and Rei, there is one thing that I actually want to mention. Out of all of these, the biggest defensive option is actually something every unit has, and that is cover. This is an extremely highly valuable mechanic that the game actually has been pushing a lot on solo raids, and I feel like even more so lately. There were multiple times throughout the different boss fights where I was actually getting hurt a lot when I'm getting hit directly. However, when I was actually properly defending and covering for that unit as it's getting hit, the damage that I'm taking on the cover seems severely lower compared to when I'm getting hit directly. This is a common thing in endgame boss raiding, and in fact it's being pushed a lot more emphasis now, especially with how SR dolls also give damage taken reduction and increases cover's max HP. My units only had R dolls, which doesn't increase the max HP, but I feel that it would have given me more breathing room for sure in terms of juggling my cover and taking hits if I had an SR doll. In case people don't know, cover's HP and defense is largely depending on the unit's level, so it's not like you need duplicates or anything for it. And since we're level capped to some content to level 400 or level sync to 400 during solo raid, there's a limit to how much we can get out of cover. Other than the unit's level, SR doll, and perhaps a few odd unit skill that affect cover like Tia or Bei, there's actually not much to affect cover stats for now. Since the team doesn't have team-wide healing, utilizing your cover to its fullest is actually very important, and even more so in this team. At times, the fight will end with you having barely enough cover, if at all. That is the true min-maxing of fights. Naturally, and again I will remind it, this is not the case for every single boss fight. There might be some boss fights where we would end up needing a healer. I'm not talking about those scenarios, and again refer to the previous section if we really need a healer. So I just want to boil it down if you can't or don't want to do the no healer strat. Skill issue. Sorry, was that toxic? Actually, let's just say that I actually meant is you need to level up your skills. Yeah, I totally meant that. So regards to this no healer team, what's the main strategy? Naturally, the strategy is going to vary from a boss to boss basis, and different content will have different requirements and breakpoints. The best I can do is give example, and we can use it as reference for future situation. What I'm about to tell you are some techniques and mechanics in raids. The first is cover iframe. To give an example in the previous solo raids, I used a no healer team on Golden Kraken, and any team can technically do it as long as you use cover mechanics and dodging the missiles on time. You can take a look at my other previous video of the shotgun no healer on Golden Kraken. The next is a DPS check. Sometimes in order to bypass some boss mechanics, having enough DPS to destroy specific parts are necessary. So having proper investment is still important. You can't just say you'll run an extremely offensive team and not expect to put in the legwork for it. This means that upgrading your skills, upgrading your gears, rolling the correct overload lines, upgrading your dolls could be some of the determining factor in achieving no healer runs. One example I could give is the Ultra Raid Phase 2, where you have to destroy the boss parts before it starts spewing out toxic poisons. Another example is the Golden Kraken, where you have to make sure to destroy the tentacles before it does a swipe. The next mechanic is the cover defense, where in some situations, there are some indicators from the bosses before it attacks, and you have to cover that unit or the whole team to prevent massive damage. Failing to do so punishes the player really hard. However, doing proper cover saves you a bunch of health. The next strategy is cover recovery. In other situations, if you have a cover recovery like Litter or Zwei, which are units that also have additional buffs themselves, you can take advantage of their cover recovery, and as long as you know the boss fight itself and know when the boss attacks, you can make sure to cover your unit and then just rely on their cover. I understand that Zwei is just buffing Pierce, but this is just kind of like giving an example in a general sense. Another strategy that I can say is delaying the QTE. In some boss fights, delaying the QTE is a strategy to borrow time for your units so that you can delay some boss mechanics before it does another targeted attacks. This borrows some time, for example, for some units like Asuka to self-heal herself back up, or to borrow some time for your cover recovery units, so that you can make sure that your cover doesn't get destroyed. Another thing with delaying the QTE is also it can be used to borrow some time before you can burst again, and sometimes it can be used so that you can use your burst to destroy some of the parts or mechanics, boss mechanics, just in time. Delaying QTE is an extremely valuable skill, and it's going to vary from boss to boss basis and what your team can handle. Next is the burst timing. And sometimes I had to reorganize my burst order to match the boss mechanics more. In usual circumstances, you would usually burst first with Asuka before Rei to take advantage of Asuka's personal buff as soon as possible. But there were some instances where I found the burst order having Rei first to be more useful. There were some times where I also felt like I had to delay my burst to accommodate with dealing with boss mechanics easier as well, since Rei's burst sometimes act as a shield or bonus HP. It does come in handy at times to keep some units alive. In some situations, I had to delay my burst timing in order to match the boss mechanics more. So sometimes bursting as soon as possible is not always the correct answer. There might be some times where you might have to end up like delaying your burst so that Asuka will have a full duration of her burst window after she took damage, instead of leaving her with only half of her burst left before she starts taking damage. The next one is the highest attack shuffle. The next situation I'm about to talk about requires a high level understanding of your account, the boss fight, and unit's knowledge, which I would personally call the highest attack shuffle. This scenario is the situation of balancing the damage taken from your team across different units against a boss that targets the highest attacks. Primarily in the situation of having both Asuka and Modernia in your team, it typically would juggle between the two of them. Asuka has over 97% attack buff to herself for 25 seconds. If we're not fast charging, there's actually a downtime for Asuka on this buff for about 5 seconds. The 25 seconds high attack buff starts the moment she bursts. During the gap between the second burst and her burst again, there's a time where Asuka doesn't have this buff. Now, people might say this is a bad thing where she is not having 100% uptime on her buff, but I would actually wager this can be a good thing. I'm not saying it's always the case, but it can be a good thing. In those downtime where she doesn't have the buff, the highest attack, assuming all units are evenly invested, will be instead Modernia. Modernia has a 30% attack buff on her own, so if Asuka's self-attack buff expires, Modernia can take up the role of having the highest attack for a brief while. This sometimes alleviates the pressure that Asuka is having if she's taking the full brunt of the highest target attack. I'm not saying that Modernia is expected to always tank whenever it's down, but with understanding the boss fight and when the boss uses the skills that targets the highest attack, you can time your burst either bursting immediately or delaying it so that Asuka is not the only one tanking if she cannot handle it alone. This is not the first situation it was possible. This is a technique that's been used in other instances as well. In the previous solo raid with Mirror Container, assuming that Maid Privity, Bunny Soda were on even investments and Maxwell having a higher investment or attack overload rolls between the three of them, it was actually possible to have the three of them shuffle the highest attack status. Maid Privity will have the highest attack when she's bursting, Bunny Soda when Soda herself is bursting, and then in between the burst timings will be Maxwell with the highest attack. You can check out that No Healer Mirror Container Shotgun Team run I did if you're curious about it. Naturally, this highest attack shuffle isn't going to work in every single account, and like I mentioned, it requires an understanding of your account, the boss mechanics, and the units themselves. But nonetheless, understanding this is a valuable skill if you want to be the best that you could ever be. So yeah, those were just some of the things I wanted to share with you, and hopefully you can come out to be a better player after all of these. Naturally, I'm not talking about if the encounter itself really forces the situation of having a healer or a tank, and again, since each boss is a unique encounter, we'll just have to make adjustments as needed. I mentioned some healer substitutes in the previous section. I talked about the different teams in the Fire Trio Combo Core video. And if you're curious about the character guide of Asuka and Rei, you can check out this other video. In any case, that's about it. If you guys want to come out and hang out with us, come over to Twitch at twitch.tv/KaiJLV, and I'll see you guys next time.